Okay, good morning. All settled now, I hope. I'm Monica. I'm one of the neurologists who works at Marta in London at the Royal London site in Whitechapel in London. And I'm a neurologist, and I'm also doing clinical trials, and I also work in the lab. So we're trying to help with one of the problems that's, there is a lot of things now, and we have been very, very lucky to have so many drugs now for people who have relapsing MS. But we have been really not very good at helping in further stages, right? So people who already have progression, we've been not so good. So what we've been doing is that we've been using the same drugs that we know are working for the relapse phase. We're trying to use them in people who already have progression. And it does help. It does help in some cases. It does help with some drugs, even though we've had some disappointing results from clinical trials, but there's still some hope in there, because in some people, even though they're in the progressive phase, there's still a lot of inflammation ongoing. So the drugs that are good for inflammation are still doing some good in these situations. But what I'll tell you about, the study that I'm going to present, is a study where we're trying to use whatever you're using for the relapses to keep the inflammation at bay, but then as a neuroprotective drug, we're using something on top of it, right? So, unlike the study that Domenico talked to you about, this is a study where we're actually having to make sure that the inflammation is at bay with a medication, whichever it is, whichever disease-modifying drug you would be using. And ultimately, as Domenico also said, the objective is that, this is representing the relapses and how you accumulate problems. And what we want is that it either goes slower or that actually it would stop those problems. And we know that it is possible, because there are studies out there where the very strong anti-inflammatory drugs have actually not only stopped any more relapses, in some cases they've actually had the opportunity for the brain to repair itself and for people to actually get better, right? So we know that there is some window of opportunity. What we also know is that these very strong anti-inflammatory drugs, when they were used in people who already didn't have any inflammation, it did not make any difference, right? So we know that there are these two phases, and that these drugs, the ones that we use and that we can prescribe on the NHS, they're good for the inflammation, but they're not doing what we need them to do in terms of neuroprotection. So here's the things that we need to do when we're dealing with multiple sclerosis. We need to take away the inflammation, because we know that every time that there's inflammation ongoing, there's more nerve loss, there's more destruction of the brain, okay? And this is what we're doing now with the disease-modifying drugs, be it the injections, be it the new tablets, the infusions. So it doesn't work for every single person, but there's actually a lot of different choices, right? Here. And now this is the bit that we're trying to address, okay? So this is nerve protection, neuroprotection, which means that there's still things that we're not doing, and this is the part that this trial and Domenico's and Floriana's trial is not going to address. So what we're trying to do is, for the nerves that have been slightly damaged because the myelin's been attacked, the lining of those nerves has been attacked, and they're prone to more damage and to die, we're trying to protect them. So this is the bit where we're trying to aim at. We're not going to make new nerve cells, and we're not aiming at doing the remyelination, so the new lining of the nerve cells. That's not the aim of our study. It may happen because by addressing the inflammation and causing neuroprotection, the ability of the brain to have some self-regeneration may work better, but it's not what we're trying to do, okay? So, again, in the clinical trial, what we have to know is whether the active drug that we're giving works better than the placebo, okay? So we all have heard of, we all have heard of people who have tried something and it worked beautifully for them, you know. And because it works beautiful for one person, it doesn't mean that it works well for most people. And this is what clinical trials address, is what's best for most people, okay? So, yes, it's not, again, it doesn't mean that it works for 100% of the people, but for most of them, and gives the most benefit. So, we're dealing with numbers, and sometimes, you know, it works really, really well for one person, and it works marginally well for other people. So, for example, when we were dealing with the injections, the interferons, all of these things, we say it's 30% less chances of having relapses. What does this mean? This means that on average, for everyone involved in the trial, there were less 30% of number of relapses. It doesn't mean that for me, I'm going to have 30% less. For some people, completely shuts down the relapses. For some people, they need something else, right? So this is what the clinical trial does, and this is why we need people who are on placebo, and we don't know and you don't know, so it's a double blind, and people who are on active drug. And then when we see the results of what's happened, we need to know that people who were on the active drug actually did better than the ones who were on the placebo. So, how did we choose the drug that we're going to use? These are our brain cells, a representation of the brain cells. This is the representation. This is actually the electron microscopy, so it's really, you can see the things. So, in the axons, so when there's damage of the lining of the myelin, all of these sodium channels become abnormal. They're usually just in between these sheets of myelin, in the nodes we call them. And in order for nerve conduction to go from brain to whatever we want to do, it's very quick and they jump around these nodes. When the myelin is gone, it's slower, right? And it's not just slower, but it distributes in a not so normal way. So we thought that this was a good way to try to protect the nerves. There's so much sodium channels exposed now that if we try to slow them down, it wouldn't slow down the conduction so much, but it would protect the nerves. And actually, this strategy has worked. This is one example of a trial that was conducted at UCL, where lamotrigine was tried. Lamotrigine is a drug that we use for epilepsy. It's a sodium channel blocker. It was used in secondary progressive multiple sclerosis. And the outcome was, like in the SMART trial, brain atrophy. Overall, it did not work, but we do know that there were situations where it did work. So for people who had a very high subproduct of the nerve, after nerve loss in their blood, that it actually did work, this drug did work. So let's go back to this product. What happens is that our nerves are made of different proteins, and one of the major ones are a protein called neurofilament. Okay? It's a really intrinsic part of the axon. So after the lining is gone and you've got the axon, this is what keeps the nerve intact. And when the myelin goes, and the axon gets targeted, all of this protein goes into the spinal fluid. Some of it might also go into the blood, but it mostly goes into the spinal fluid. And we know that people who have the highest amount of this protein, neurofilament, in the spinal fluid, there are people who do worse in the long term. Okay, so it represents an acute loss, so there's an acute loss of nerves, but it also represents how not so well people are going to do later on. It's not absolute, but because there's still a lot of people down here, but there is a correlation there. So we thought that we should try that, and we know that it works for when people have relapses. Every time that there's an inflammation, every time that there's an inflammatory attack, there's more damage of the nerves, there's more neurofilament in the spinal fluid, and if you use a drug that's very good at stopping inflammation from going into the brain, such as natalizumab, Tysabri, or Lemtrada now, we know that the amount of neurofilament in the spinal fluid really comes down, so it sort of shows that there's not as much nerve loss going on. And we wanted to translate this into the part of, rather than having a very long clinical trial where we measure how much people can walk and how fast people can walk, and we all know that, you know, there's better weeks and worse weeks. That's why it has to take so long. It's, you know, to account for all of those better periods and worse periods, if we want to measure it properly, it has to take a long time. So rather than using this type of the usual measurement that we use for these situations, that can take, I mean, here it's 7 years, the reality is longer even. We thought that if we use this neurofilament in the spinal fluid, it's a much more accurate measure. So rather than waiting 3 years for the walking to stay the same or become worse, we measure how much nerve loss is in fact happening. And in this point, it's not the nerve loss from the relapses, it's the nerve loss that's crumbling in the background that represents the continuous nerve loss, right? All of us have it because that's part of aging, but when there's an active process that we know there is in multiple sclerosis, that nerve loss is increased. And you've seen it in the slides that Domenico showed about brain shrinkage. That also happens for anyone, but in people with MS, it can happen faster. Okay? Oops, so it's continuing to jump. So basically, rather than testing a lot of people over a long period of time, by using a very accurate measure, we can use a lot fewer people and do it in a lot shorter time. Okay? So this is what we plan to do, or we're doing already. But of course, when we talk about lumbar punctures, a lot of people shudder. A lot of people have had their experiences, a lot of people just shudder at the thought, really. Well, we're trying to change that because it shouldn't be much worse than taking bloods, okay? And, you know, a lot of people have had a bad experience because when they did the lumbar puncture, we were still using these kinds of needles, right? And these kinds of needles, when they pass through, they cut a little bit of the fiber so that they can go through. We're using now these types of needles that pull the fibers away, rather. So, after the needle comes out, you know how it is when you take blood, that sometimes there's more blood coming out than others. So, in this situation, there's a higher chance that there is a very slow leak of fluid, and that's what causes the headaches, and the headaches that are worse when you stand up, cause dizziness and everything. There's a lot less chance of it happening with this kind of needle. So we've changed that, and we've had a study in our center where it showed again, because it's been shown in other places, that it actually makes a difference in terms of headaches afterwards. Can also use ultrasound, so to make sure where the place for the needle is. And if you want to look up in this website, that's what the group has constructed in order to tell people what's happening during the event. You know, for people who have never had one or had one when they were in hospital and they can't really remember very much of what happened. This is to make it easier to know what to expect. So it's about drinking plenty of fluids, and that you don't have to come without any food because that can make you feel worse. It's about what happens in the procedure itself, the local anesthetic, the position that you should be in, the needle type, what we take out, different types of needles. So, in terms of targeting the progressive phase of MS, you know, as I said, at the moment there's lots of drugs for the relapsing phase, and there's still not very much for the progressive phase, but we're trying to address that. And you know, after this part of the relapse phase and the part of the progressive phase, you know, there are trials now at different stages. The trial that Domenico has presented to you is the part of the secondary progressive phase when people are not needing any more disease-modifying drugs. Okay, they can walk. They're not needing any more disease-modifying drugs. The part for the Proximus trial is the people who are still using disease-modifying drugs. They have difficulties, so they haven't had any relapse, but they feel that they're not getting any better. They're in fact feeling that things are not getting any better or actually getting a bit worse. Doesn't need to be really that you cannot walk. In fact, we need people to be able to walk with a stick for 100 meters. But, you know, it's this early phase, so that we have more to protect. Okay? So that's the area where we're focusing. And there's other things ongoing. So this is one of the studies with a very similar type of drug, a sodium channel blocker 2. It has shown that for people who have acute optic neuritis, if they take a drug which is in the same family as the drug that we're using, it actually protects their nerves. So not only they can not lose their vision, but actually when they measure the amount of nerves that were left, there were a lot more for people who were on this drug. This is the study that we're doing for people who are on feeling that they're progressive symptoms, but they're still needing their disease-modifying drugs. And this is the SMART study, which is after that, when people are a bit on the progressive phase and not needing the disease-modifying drugs anymore.
Thank you.
Any questions?